Speaking of Courage, Part 2, starting at page 140. Out on the lake, the man in the stalled motorboat was still fiddling with his engine. The pair of mud hens floated like wooden decoys, and the water skiers looked tan and athletic, and the high school band was packing up its instruments, and the woman in the pedal pushers patiently rebaited her hook for another try. Quaint, he thought. A hot summer day, and it was all very quaint and remote. The four workmen had almost completed their preparations for the evening fireworks. Facing the sun again, Norman Bowker decided it was nearly 7 o'clock. Not much later, the tired radio announcer confirmed it, his voice rocking itself into a deep Sunday snooze. If Max Arnold were here, he would say something about the announcer's fatigue and relate it to the bright pink in the sky and the war and courage. A pity that Max was gone, and a pity about his father, who had his own war and who now preferred silence. Still, there was so much to say. How the rain never stopped, how the cold worked into your bones. Sometimes the bravest thing on earth was to sit through the night and feel the cold in your bones. Courage was not always a matter of yes or no. Sometimes it came in degrees, like the cold. Sometimes you were very brave, up to a point, and then beyond that point you were not so brave. In certain situations you could do incredible things. You could advance toward enemy fire, but in other situations, which were not nearly so bad, you had trouble keeping your eyes open. Sometimes, like that night in the shit field, the difference between courage and cowardice was something small and stupid. The way the earth bubbled, and the smell. In a soft voice, without flourishes, he would have told the exact truth. Late in the night, he would have said, we took some mortar fire. He would have explained how it was still raining, and how the clouds were pasted to the field, and how the mortar rounds seemed to come right out of the clouds. Everything was black and wet. The field just exploded. Rain and slop and shrapnel, nowhere to run, and all they could do was worm down into the slime and cover up and wait. He would have described the crazy things he saw, unnatural things, like how at one point he noticed a guy lying next to him in the sludge, completely buried except his face, and how after a moment the guy rolled his eyes and winked at him. The noise was fierce. Heavy thunder and mortar rounds and people yelling. Some men began shooting up flares, red and green and silver flares, all colors, and the rain came down in technicolor. The field was boiling. The shells made deep, slushy craters, opening up all those years of waste, centuries' worth, and the smell came bubbling out of the earth. 2 rounds hit close by, then a third even closer, and immediately off to his left he heard somebody screaming. It was Kiowa. He knew that. The sound was ragged and clotted up, but even so he knew the voice. A strange, gargling sound. Rolling sideways, he crawled toward the screaming in the dark. The rain was hard and steady, although along the perimeter there were quick bursts of gunfire. Another round hit nearby, spraying up shit and water, and for a few moments he ducked down beneath the mud. He heard the valves in his heart. He heard the quick, feathering actions of the hinges. Extraordinary, he thought. As he came up, a pair of red flares puffed open, a slow, blurry glow. In the glow he saw Kiowa's wide-open eyes, settling down into the scum. All he could do was watch. He heard himself moan, and then he moved again, crabbing forward. But when he got there, Kiowa was almost completely under. There was a knee, there was an arm, and a wristwatch and part of a boot. He could not describe what happened next, not ever, but he would have tried anyway. He would have spoken carefully so as to make it real for anyone who would listen. There were bubbles where Kiowa's head should have been. The left hand was curled open, the fingers were filthy. The wristwatch gave off a green phosphorescent shine as it slipped beneath the thick waters. He would have talked about this, and how he grabbed Kiowa by the boot and tried to pull him out. He pulled hard, but Kiowa was gone. And then suddenly he felt himself going too. The shit was in his nose and eyes. There were flares and mortar rounds, and the stink was everywhere. It was inside him, in his lungs, and he could no longer tolerate it. Not here, he thought, not like this. He released Kiowa's boot and watched it slide away. Slowly working his way up, he hoisted himself out of the deep mud, and then he lay still and tasted the shit in his mouth, and closed his eyes and listened to the rain and explosions and bubbling sounds. He was alone. He had lost his weapon, but it didn't matter. All he wanted was a bath. Nothing else. A hot, soapy bath. Circling the lake, Norman Bowker remembered how his friend Kiowa had disappeared under the waist in water. "I didn't flip out," he would have said. "I was cool. If things had gone right, if it hadn't been for that smell, I could have won the Silver Star." A good war story, he thought. But it was not a war for war stories, nor for talk of valor, and nobody in town wanted to know about the terrible stink. They wanted good intentions and good deeds. But this town was not to blame, really. It was a nice little town, very prosperous, with neat houses and all the sanitary conveniences. Norman Bowker lit a cigarette and cranked open his window. 7:35, he decided. The lake had divided into two halves. One half still glistened, the other half caught in shadow. Along the causeway the two little boys marched on. The man in the stalled motorboat yanked frantically on the cord to his engine, and the two mud hens sought supper at the bottom of the lake, tails bobbing. He passed Sunset Park once again, and more houses, and the junior college, and the tennis courts, and the picnickers, who now sat waiting for the evening fireworks. The high school band was gone. The woman in pedal pushers patiently toyed with her line. Although it was not yet dusk, the A&W was already awash in neon lights. He maneuvered his father's Chevy into one of the parking slots, let the engine idle, and then sat back. The place was doing a good holiday business. Mostly kids, it seemed, and a few farmers in for the day. He did not recognize any of the faces. A slim, hipless young car hop passed by, but when he hit the horn, she did not seem to notice. Her eyes slid sideways. She hooked a tray on the window of the Firebird, laughing lightly, leaning forward to chat with the three boys inside. He felt invisible in the soft twilight. Straight ahead, over the take-out counter, swarms of mosquitoes electrocuted themselves against an aluminum pest-rid machine. It was a calm, quiet summer evening. He honked again, this time leaning on the horn. The young car hop turned slowly, as if puzzled, then said something to the boys in the Firebird, and moved reluctantly toward him. Pinned to his shirt was a badge that said, "Eat Mama Burgers." When she reached the window, she stood straight up so that all he could see was the badge. "Mama Burger," he said. "Maybe some fries, too?" The girl sighed and leaned down. She shook her head. Her eyes were as fluffy and airy light as cotton candy. "You blind?" she said. She put out her hand and tapped an intercom attached to a steel post. "Punch the button and place your order. All I do is carry the dumb trays." She stared at him for a moment. Briefly he thought a question lingered in her fuzzy eyes, and then she turned and punched the button for him and returned to her friends in the Firebird. The intercom squawked and said, "Order." "Mama Burger and fries," Norman Bowker said. "Affirmative, copy clear. No Rooty Tooty?" "Rooty Tooty?" "You know, man. Root beer." "A small one." "Roger Dodger." "Repeat, 1 mama, 1 fries, 1 small beer." "Fire for effect. Stand by." The intercom squeaked and went dead. "Out," said Norman Bowker. When the girl brought his tray, he ate quickly, without looking up. The tired radio announcer in Des Moines gave the time, almost 8:30. Dark was pressing in tight now, and he wished there were somewhere to go. In the morning, he'd check out job possibilities, shoot a few buckets down at the Y, maybe wash the Chevy. He finished his root beer and pushed the intercom button. "Order," said the tinny voice. "All done." "That's it?" "I guess so." "Hey, loosen up," the voice said. "What do you really need, friend?" Norman Bowker smiled. "Well," he said, "how'd you like to hear about—" He stopped and shook his head. "Hear what, man?" "Nothing." "Well, hey," the intercom said. I'm sure not going anywhere. Screwed to a post, for God's sake. Go ahead. Try me." "Nothing." "You sure?" "Positive. All done." The intercom made a light sound of disappointment. "Your choice, I guess. Over and out." "Out," said Norman Bowker. On his 10th turn around the lake, he passed the hiking boys for the last time. The man in the stalled motorboat was gone. The mud hens were gone. Beyond the lake, over Sally Gustafson's house, the sun had left a smudge of purple on the horizon. The band shell was deserted, and the woman in pedal pushers quietly reeled in her line, and Dr. Mason's sprinkler went round and round. On his 11th revolution he switched off the air conditioning, opened up the window, and rested his elbow comfortably on the sill, driving with one hand. There was nothing to say. He could not talk about it and never would. The evening was smooth and warm. If it had been possible, which it wasn't, he would have explained how his friend Kiowa slipped away that night beneath the dark, swampy field. He would have folded in with the war. He was part of the waste. Turning on the headlights, driving slowly, Norman Bowker remembered how he had taken hold of Kiowa's boot and pulled hard, and how the smell was simply too much, and how he'd backed off, and in that way had lost the Silver Star. He wished he could have explained some of this, how he had been braver than he ever thought possible, but how he'd not been so brave as he wanted to be. The distinction was important. Max Arnold, who loved fine lines, would have appreciated it, and his father, who already knew, would have nodded. The truth, Norman Bowker would have said, is I let the guy go. Maybe he was already gone. He wasn't. But maybe... No. I could feel it. He wasn't. Some things you can feel. His father would have been quiet for a while, watching the headlights against the narrow tar road. Well, anyway, the old man would have said, there's still the 7 medals. I suppose. 7 honeys. Right. On his 12th revolution, the sky went crazy with color. He pulled into Sunset Park and stopped in the shadow of a picnic shelter. After a long time he got out, walked down to the beach and waded into the lake without undressing. The water felt warm against his skin. He put his head under, opened his lips very slightly for the taste, and then stood up and folded his arms and watched the fireworks. For a small town, he decided, it was a pretty good show.